Something happened behind the scenes, and you still do not know the whole story. While you were living your life, minding your own business and simply being yourself, someone connected to your destiny was led to see the truth about you in a way they could no longer ignore. What they discovered did not just catch their attention, it changed their heart. It changed the way they looked at you. It changed the way they looked at the people around them. Listen carefully, because this message is not a small one. Someone believed they understood you from a distance. They thought they had you figured out, but the closer they looked, the more they realized you were not like the people they had known before. You were not hiding behind a mask. You were not trying to win approval. You were not saying one thing while doing another. You were steady, genuine, and quietly honest in a way that could not be copied. Once they truly saw that, something inside them began to break away from what no longer felt right. Stay with me, because the deeper truth is this. They did not cut someone off because of drama alone. They walked away because discovering who you really are exposed what was no longer true in their own life. Once that kind of truth enters a person's heart, it does not simply disappear. It grows, it pushes, it changes everything. So, if this feels like your story, keep listening, because what happened next says more than you may realize. At first, they were not searching for some huge revelation. They were simply watching quietly and naturally. They noticed the way you spoke to people when there was nothing to gain. They noticed how you carried yourself during difficult moments. They noticed how you stayed true to your values, even when it would have been easier to bend, pretend, or follow what everyone else was doing. These were not loud signs. They were small moments, but small moments often reveal the biggest truths. Anyone can act kind for a short time. Anyone can create a good image when people are watching, but real character appears through patterns, repeated choices, and the way someone behaves when there is no reward waiting at the end. That is what they began to see in you. Pattern after pattern. Choice after choice. Moment after moment. Slowly, the picture became clear. They started to understand that the person you seemed to be was the person you truly were. That realization affected them more deeply than they expected because, deep down, they had become used to inconsistency. They had become familiar with mixed signals, half-truths, polished words, and empty promises. But with you, they kept seeing alignment. Your words matched your actions. Your energy matched your heart. Your presence felt the same up close as it did from a distance. That kind of truth is rare, very rare. If you have ever wondered whether your authenticity matters, hear this clearly. It matters far more than you realize. Sometimes your truth is speaking into rooms you have never entered. There may have been people around them talking about you, sharing opinions, repeating pieces of information without knowing the full story, planting ideas based on assumptions, jealousy, fear, or their own limited understanding. For a little while, your person may have listened, not because they wanted to turn against you, but because when people feel uncertain, they often look outside themselves for answers. That happens. But the more they observed you for themselves, the weaker those outside voices became, because truth grows stronger when it is tested. The closer they looked, the harder it became to believe anything that did not match what they were actually seeing. That is where everything started to change. They were no longer comparing you to rumors. They were comparing rumors to reality, and reality kept winning. They saw consistency. They saw depth. They saw a quiet honesty that did not need to defend itself every few minutes. Once that realization settled in, it started changing more than just their opinion of you. It began changing their whole emotional world. Suddenly, certain conversations in their life felt shallow. Certain people felt like they were pretending. Certain relationships started feeling heavy instead of safe. That is what truth does. It creates contrast. It reveals what had been hidden in plain sight. Without even planning it, they began looking at everything differently. The people they kept close, the relationships they continued investing in, the stories they had accepted for so long. Every time they reflected on you, one thought kept returning like an echo they could not silence. This person is real. Keep listening, because that thought became the beginning of a chain reaction. The more they realized your character was genuine, the more uncomfortable other parts of their life became. Not all at once, not like a dramatic movie scene. Quietly, slowly, but with real power, they started thinking more deeply about the people around them, about who truly supported their growth and who only liked the version of them that stayed small, confused, or easy to control. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. Who feels honest? Who leaves me feeling drained? Who is here because of love? And who is here only because of habit? Who speaks life into me? And who keeps me trapped in circles that no longer match my future? These were not easy questions. They carried real weight because the answers were going to change something important. Deep inside, they already knew it. What they discovered about you was not only teaching them about your character, it was teaching them about their own standards, their needs, and the future they truly wanted. They began to realize that some relationships in their life were surviving on routine instead of real alignment. They were surviving on comfort instead of truth. They were surviving because holding on felt easier than admitting that the season had already ended. If this message is reaching you, stay with me, because this is the part many people miss. Big endings do not always begin with loud arguments. Sometimes they begin with quiet clarity. A person simply wakes up to something they can no longer ignore. That is exactly where your soulmate was heading. With every new realization about you, the old excuses in their life slowly started falling apart. They became more aware, more honest, and less willing to keep calling something fine when deep inside, it no longer felt right. There was someone in their life during all of this, someone whose place had become familiar, someone they kept around, not because the connection was deeply meaningful, but because it was known, predictable, and easy to return to. It was a relationship built more on habit than on real peace. For a while, they continued living through that routine as though nothing had changed. They still showed up. They still played the same role. They still tried to keep everything normal. But inside them, normal was already falling apart. Every time they thought about your authenticity, the difference became harder to ignore. What felt real with you made what felt forced somewhere else stand out even more. It was never about perfect versus imperfect. It was about real versus empty. It was about emotional honesty versus emotional convenience. The person they eventually walked away from may not have realized what was happening at first, because from the outside, everything can appear the same while an entire inner world is quietly being rebuilt. But inside your soulmate, the distance kept growing. Conversations that once felt meaningful started sounding repetitive. Energy that once felt comforting began to feel exhausting. Situations they once excused became harder and harder to defend. They were not searching for faults. They were not trying to create an ending. In fact, part of them wanted to avoid change completely because change is difficult. Letting go is difficult. Admitting that something has come to an end is difficult. But truth has its own timing. It does not wait for comfort. It arrives when it is ready. Once it settles into the heart, it asks for honesty. So, night after night, thought after thought, they sat with a truth they were not fully ready to say out loud. Something in their life no longer matched the person they were becoming. That is when the inner struggle became louder. They replayed old conversations. They looked back at familiar patterns. They questioned why certain interactions left them feeling tired, small, or disconnected. They asked themselves whether they were staying loyal to a relationship that had already lost its heart. They wondered if they were holding on because it was love or simply because it was familiar. That question changed everything, because once a person asks it honestly, the answer slowly begins to find them. At first, little by little, then all at once. They started realizing that some people had only fit the older version of themselves, the version that accepted misalignment, ignored intuition, and stayed too long where truth was missing. But they were changing now. The more they changed, the less that old connection made sense. This is what discovering you awakened inside them. Courage. Not loud courage. Not reckless courage. Real courage. The kind that helps a person tell the truth to themselves before telling anyone else. The kind that quietly says, I cannot keep pretending this still feels right. The kind that honestly admits, I have outgrown this, even if letting go hurts. If you are still listening, hear this part carefully. They did not make this decision in one emotional moment. They arrived there through many quiet moments of clarity. That often makes a decision even stronger, because when someone has had time to think, feel, compare, reflect, and still reaches the same truth, that truth becomes impossible to ignore. By then, the question was no longer, should I pay attention to this? The question had become, how much longer can I keep ignoring what my heart already knows? That is a powerful place to reach, because once someone arrives there, action is usually close. Eventually, they reach the point where pretending became heavier than honesty. There may not have been one dramatic argument. There may not have been obvious betrayal. There may not have been a shocking ending that everyone could easily explain. What happened was deeper than that. Clarity arrived. Quiet, steady clarity. The kind that does not shout, but still changes a person's life. They realized the relationship they had been holding on to no longer reflected the person they were becoming. It no longer supported the higher standard growing inside them. No matter how much guilt, doubt, or sadness came with that realization, they could not unknow the truth. So, they made a choice. A difficult choice. A quiet choice. A necessary choice. They let someone go, not because it was easy, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, and not because they wanted drama, but because truth had finally become stronger than comfort. When they made that decision, they felt something unexpected. Relief. Not instant happiness. Not celebration. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when inner conflict finally begins to settle. The kind that comes when someone stops fighting against what they already know in their heart. That feeling mattered because it showed them they had not acted out of impulse. They had acted out of alignment. Once that space opened, emotional space, mental space, and spiritual space, they began thinking about you even more. Not in a careless or impulsive way, but in a meaningful one. With distractions removed, your presence became even clearer inside their heart. Remember this, the person they released was never the true center of this story. The real center was awakening. The real center was the truth they discovered through you. The real center was the moment your authenticity made them examine everything false they had been accepting. After that ending, they entered a different season within themselves, a quieter season, a deeper season. The noise around them slowly faded, and in that silence came an understanding they had avoided for a long time. They began to see how often fear had shaped their choices. Fear of change. Fear of losing what was familiar. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of walking away from something that was not completely right, even if it was not completely wrong either. But once those fears were brought into the light, they slowly began losing their power, because fear grows strongest in darkness, while truth brings light. Your soulmate started realizing that what they found in you was not perfection. It was something even more powerful: integrity, steadiness, and a person whose inner life and outer life were in harmony. That reminded them of what they truly wanted for themselves. It reminded them of the kind of life they wanted to build, the kind of relationships they wanted to choose, and the kind of honesty they wanted to live by. That is why your impact reached so deeply. You did not force them to change. You did not chase them toward growth. You simply stayed true to who you are, and your truth became a mirror. A mirror that showed them what was missing. A mirror that showed them what was possible, a mirror that revealed the difference between simply surviving and truly living. If this message is touching your spirit, stay until the end, because this part truly matters. Sometimes the strongest influence is not loud advice. Sometimes it is simply the presence of someone genuine, someone who reminds another person that real people still exist. Once someone experiences that kind of truth, they can no longer keep settling for what feels empty inside. As time passed, they stopped asking why this happened and started asking what they were meant to do with it. That became the next major turning point, because awareness alone does not change a person's life. Action does. They had already made one difficult decision by letting a connection go. Now they were being called to go even deeper, to change the way they thought, to change what they accepted, to change how they responded whenever something no longer felt right. The old patterns no longer fit. The old excuses sounded weaker than before. The old distractions slowly lost their attraction. Little by little, they became more honest with themselves. They began to see how often conflict had disguised itself as peace, how often familiarity had looked like love, and how often fear had pretended to be logic. Once they saw those things clearly, there was no way to return to the old way of thinking. You need to understand this. What they discovered about you did not only make them admire you, it woke them up. It helped them realize they had been settling in quiet ways they had never fully admitted, settling for inconsistency, settling for emotional half-measures, settling for relationships that looked stable on the outside but felt empty underneath. Once their eyes were opened, they could not force themselves to close them again. This is where real transformation begins, not through fantasy, not through daydreams, not through wishful thinking. It begins with clear vision, honest truth, and the decision to stop betraying what your heart already knows. So every new day, every quiet moment of reflection, every memory of your energy kept bringing them back to the same realization. You did not enter their life simply to entertain them. You entered it to change something within them. Whether they expected that or not, it was already happening. They also started understanding that your influence was never only about appearance, timing, or attraction. It was about what your presence represented, genuineness, sincerity, and a rare kind of emotional alignment that cut through confusion. The more they thought about you, the more they realized they were not only moved by who you are, but also by what you awakened inside them. You reminded them of their own depth, their own values, their own desire for something honest. That is why this discovery affected them so deeply. It touched something inside that had been waiting to be remembered. Once remembered, it could never be forgotten. They began looking at their whole life through a clearer lens, their habits, their boundaries, their standards, their future. They could now see that staying attached to what no longer matched their heart would only delay the life they were truly meant to build. That did not mean everything became easy overnight. Growth is rarely neat or simple. Some days brought peace, some days brought doubt, some days brought sadness over what had ended. But through every emotional wave, one deeper truth stayed steady. They had changed, truly changed. The version of themselves that once ignored warning signs, excused emotional emptiness, and confused routine with real connection was slowly disappearing. In its place stood someone more awake, more discerning, and more willing to choose truth, even when truth required loss before it brought something better. If you are still listening, do not miss this part. Sometimes the reason a person leaves one relationship is not because another person asked them to. It is because another person's authenticity gave them the courage to finally admit what had already been fading. That is the deeper story here, and that story is still unfolding. Now they stand in a place where confusion no longer controls them the way it once did. The noise has become quieter, the illusions have grown weaker, the excuses no longer work as they once did. They now understand that genuine connection is not built on convenience. They know trust cannot be replaced by routine. They understand that emotional alignment matters far more than familiar patterns that no longer feed the soul. As these truths become stronger within them, so does the meaning of what they discovered about you. They now see that your authenticity was never a small detail. It became the turning point. It was the moment the old mask they had been living behind started falling away. It was the moment they realized that every ending creates room for a new beginning, and every honest decision makes space for something more real to enter. That is why they cannot simply move forward as though nothing happened. Something did happen, something real, something deep, something that changed the structure of their inner world. Without even trying, you showed them that honest people still exist, that consistency still exists, that values can still be lived instead of only talked about. Once someone experiences that kind of reminder, their whole understanding of love, loyalty, and the future begins to rise. They stop reaching for what only fills empty time. They begin searching for what truly feeds the heart. That is where they are now, standing between what used to be and what could become, living in the quiet space after letting go and before fully arriving. If you have been feeling this change in the air, trust that feeling. Some transformations happen quietly, long before they become visible. Some of the biggest decisions are made in silence before anyone else hears a single word. The truth is, this journey is not only about what they learned about you, it is also about what your presence helped them remember about themselves. They remembered they were never meant to live only half awake. They remembered that peace truly matters. They remembered that deep inside, they had always known when something felt wrong, even if it took them a long time to act on it. They remembered that their heart was never asking for perfection. It was asking for truth. That memory changed everything. Now, when they look back, they can clearly see how every small observation, every quiet moment of reflection, and every emotional contrast was leading them to this point. Not toward fantasy, not toward illusion, but toward a more honest life. A life where they choose what is real instead of what is easy. A life where they stop staying loyal to patterns that no longer match their spirit. A life where they finally trust what clarity has been trying to tell them all along. Yes, part of that clarity carries your energy throughout it because you became proof that substance still exists in a world filled with appearances. You became the reminder that someone can be gentle and strong, calm and powerful, simple and unforgettable at the same time. That kind of presence stays with a person. It lingers. It teaches. It quietly changes things. So if you have been wondering whether your truth reached them, the answer is yes. It reached them far more deeply than you realize. What it awakened inside them is still unfolding, still growing, and still shaping choices they can no longer ignore. Sometimes the greatest gift one person gives another is not a promise, not a title, and not a dramatic confession. Sometimes it is simply the truth their presence reveals. Once that truth is truly felt, nothing remains the same forever.